Thank you very much. And I was looking out as I was coming over, and my first thought was, if you had told me when I came to Oregon in the 70s that we would have a program like this in Oregon, that we would have a tech fest with stars from the technology field all over the world in Rip City, I would have told you you were hallucinating. So let's give a big round of applause to Mark Zussman, all the folks at Willamette Week, for a very important, effort, bringing so much creativity to our hometown. Last year, I spoke with all of you on the eve of the Intelligence Committee's first public hearing that was taking place as part of the Russia investigation. A couple of takeaways from my front row seat, looking into Russia's interference in our election, and then the security of our voting system. First, through public hearings and the other accounts over the last year, what has been clear is how vulnerable our election system is to attack. How vulnerable our sacred democratic institutions are to meddling. And equally troubling is the Trump administration's attack on the privacy of law-abiding Americans, especially if they are allowed to get away with it. So the first thing I want to say in front of folks in my hometown, on my watch, they are not going to be able to get away with compromising our privacy, compromising our liberties, and the Russian investigation is not going to get swept under the rug, period. And the fact is, security and liberty with smart policies are not mutually exclusive. You can have both. Now, too often, as we've seen with issues like encryption, the government manages to come up with approaches that give us less of both, which is what you get if you weaken strong encryption. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is outline essentially three core kinds of principles I believe can help keep us safe, keep us secure, without sacrificing core liberties. The first of these core battles arose recently. My guess is that most people may have heard about this little thing going on with Facebook, modest-sized company. And when this all exploded into our televisions and newspapers and the like, and what a dramatic retreat from what Mark Zuckerberg promised. I mean, you can see on YouTube, Mark Zuckerberg said, we will not have what he has now admitted to having taken place, the sacrifice of the data of his users. So I wrote to Facebook on March 19th to ask a bunch of tough questions. I'm the son of a journalist, and my dad always said the job was to ask tough questions, and I think that's part of what folks are up to at Willamette Week. So, for example, I want to know if this Cambridge Analytica scandal is a one-off, or if other companies have been downloading data on millions of Americans without their knowledge. It's pretty clear the folks at Facebook are not tripping over themselves to get back to me on that. But let me be clear. Big companies cannot take little responsibility for big problems. 2 billion Facebook users have serious questions. So do I. The country doesn't need more apologies from tech companies after years and years of sitting on their hands and misusing America's most private information. Pretty hard to have a lot of sympathy now for Facebook, Equifax, Twitter, or anybody else who hasn't managed their platforms. And the fact is, I wrote the law, Section 230, to give them more tools to manage their platforms. So right now I'm co-sponsoring legislation that's going to bring down the hammer on companies allowing these types of unforgivable data breaches. Facebook made some other mistakes other than what you've seen in the last week. First, they blew it in the 2016 election. We're still finding out why and how, and I'm working with my colleagues in the Senate to do our best to make sure it doesn't happen again. Second, and most importantly, Facebook has absolutely failed at responsibly managing its platform by letting its algorithms get hijacked by extreme or fake content that ends up dividing the country. So here's where Section 230 comes in. Back when I came to the Senate and hardly anybody knew how to use a computer, I had a chance to be part of the effort to write the rules of the road for the internet. And at that time, it looked like if you set up a website or a blog, you could get held personally liable for everything posted on your site. And I said, I don't know everything about this internet, but I know it's going to be hard to get anybody to make an investment in a small enterprise that dreams of being big. So we wrote a law that provided a sword and a shield. The shield basically said that you couldn't hold the owner of a website personally liable for something posted on their site. The sword was that they had to police their platforms, that those platforms weren't just a bunch of neutral, pipes. There's one commentator said my law created $1 trillion worth of value in the private economy. This sparked my wife Nancy to say, I haven't seen any of this $1 trillion. And she said, well, if you did, it just goes to show that a blind squirrel can find an acorn once in a while. But the point is, this was a bedrock principle of a law that allowed Facebook and Twitter and all of the social media to start small and grow and prosper. And despite the importance of this bedrock law, Section 230, governing social media and the net, Facebook chose to support the first major attack on this legal foundation. They did it knowing full well that they have the resources to survive while new competitors are going to be limited. So in effect, Facebook is now pulling up the ladder, and pulling up the ladder behind you is not exactly the mark of an innovative company. Now there's another side to Section 230 that's often overlooked, which says platforms like Facebook can moderate some of their content without being liable for all of it. Facebook does do some moderating. That's a good thing. But in my mind, these particularly large companies have an ethical responsibility, if not a legal responsibility, to create an internet where people want to spend their time, and they have not done a good job on that. That is not to say there shouldn't be platforms that serve absolute free speech. But if you're claiming to be responsible and have standards, you got to live up to those claims. At its core, the reason why Facebook is in hot water is essentially the same reason why Equifax is in hot water. These companies have not fully gotten their heads around the idea that the data they collect on folks and sell is more than just their property. it is not just their property. The data you collect in the real world, actions and beliefs and preferences of a human being, when you have that data stolen and breached or leaked because of corporate inaction and carelessness, it's more than just ones and zeros going out the door. It's more than the loss of a business asset. It is a company abandoning its responsibility as custodian of that information. So the second area, and I know we're going to talk about Facebook when we sit down with Mark, is you may have heard a bit about the stingrays. And a stingray is a fake cell tower that tricks your phone into thinking it's a real AT&T or Verizon tower. For decades, the government used stingrays to exploit flaws in cell phones to track surveillance targets, tap their calls, and intercept their texts. These dragnet surveillance devices don't just target one person. They sweep up information about all the phones in the area. Now until recently, law enforcement routinely hid their use of stingrays from Congress and the courts and from defendants. In 2015, the federal government improved the policy so they must get search warrants before using stingrays. That, however, doesn't apply to state or local law enforcement officials. There also are no penalties if the feds violate their own policies. So that's why I introduced the GPS Act. And that would require federal, state, and local law enforcement to get a warrant before they use a stingray to conduct surveillance. Now, the most recent and possibly some of the most important news about stingrays came this week. This week, the Department of Homeland Security responded to a letter I wrote indicating that they found stingrays being used in Washington, D.C., and other locations in the country. Now, obviously, there are a lot of powerful people in Washington that foreign governments might want to spy on. Foreign companies advertise and sell similar technology, and it's been bought by government around the world, many of which are hostile to the United States. Hackers can build their basic versions of this technology for just a few $100s. So that is why it is even more important to make sure that technology companies are not forced to weaken the encryption in the phones they sell to Americans. With the clear threat posed by foreign governments and criminals spying on our calls, information that I got just this week, folks, we need more security for our phones. We need the strongest possible encryption, not less. I hope you will join me in fighting the FBI and any efforts to force companies to build backdoors into their products and weaken strong encryption in America. So let me close with one last matter, and that's defending the election system from cyber attacks. You may have seen that we had a hearing in the Intelligence Committee, one of our open hearings. Homeland Security officials were there and others. And I pointed out that 43% of Americans use voting machines to vote. And there have been some blood-curdling accounts of what goes on with these voting machines. One particular press account, I'm going to speak intel here because I don't want to get into classified matters, described how one of the large companies, according to the press, actually installed remote access software, which would make it a dream for a hacker or a terrorist to get access to this information. I guess the thought was, well, we'll just make it easier on our repair staff, so we'll just make it possible for foreigners to get easier access to it. So, I think there's something we ought to do about this. I think there's something we ought to do at a time when Russians and others threaten our democratic institutions. And in a sentence, I think it's time to take Oregon's vote-by-mail system national. We have had this for 20 years. I'm proud to have been the first United States Senator to have been elected in an entirely vote-by-mail system. Vote-by-mail, of course, gives you a paper trail for every ballot that is cast. And I am going to soon introduce a new election cybersecurity bill to ensure the reliability and accuracy of federal election results, even if foreign hackers do manage to attack the voting machines used by states. The bill is going to combine two common sense measures recommended by all the cybersecurity paper ballots, as well as routine and rigorous risk-limiting audits after elections. And federal officials told me at a recent Senate Intelligence Committee hearing that paperless voting machines pose a national security threat. Here's the bottom line, folks. We do not ask our counties and cities to fight America's wars against national threats. We wouldn't say that this is something for the local water board to deal with these kinds of national security threats. So we have got to pursue this as a national security matter. And when the biggest manufacturers of the voting machines have refused to answer even the most basic questions about cybersecurity, practices, then you have to say to yourself, it is time for strong federal action. Insecure, paperless voting systems are vulnerable to cyber attack, foreign interference, and even run-of-the-mill counting errors. And with the kind of approach that I have advocated, we can restore the confidence of Americans in the federal election system. So what is the common thread behind what I have just described? Facebook abuses, stingrays, and election security is the need for vigilance. And let me just say that letting down our guard against external attacks to technology or internal attacks on our privacy and civil liberties, as long as I have the opportunity and the honor to represent Oregon in the United States Senate, not on my watch. Thanks for having me, everybody. Thank you.
So, Facebook, to what degree should we blame you? And by you, I mean Congress. If you look at the degree to which Europe has attempted to regulate these tech platforms, they seem to be much further ahead than the United States. Is there truth to that?
Yes. And look, the reality is, from the very first days when the chairman of the major technology committee in the Senate was asked about the internet, and he said, what's the fussing about? It's just a series of tubes, which caused the entire country and the late night comedians to just have a field day. The Senate and the Congress have not moved as fast as they should with respect to these technology, issues. It's one of the reasons why I spend so much of my time, in effect, going out almost kind of like Paul Revere and clanking this bell to try to lay out what these threats are. So yes, the Congress should have had hearings far earlier to look at the possibility of these threats and act. Absolutely.
Is it because the average age of a member of Congress is 66 and they're not digital natives and they don't understand this technology? Or is it money in politics? I mean, why the delay?
Well, I think a couple of things. First, you have to keep this matter of the chronological age in the Senate in perspective. My older child said the other day, she said, "Dad, there are something like 20 senators older than you. Are you in the only profession on earth where you're kind of a young guy?" And I think the point is senators have a lot of stuff on their plate. They're going to have the farmers come in because the farm bill is coming up. And you can just go on and on with the litany, of issues. But I think it's clear that these questions, it's why you have health tech as a program, because tech is going to drive everything. So I don't think Congress can duck just by saying it's busy or that some members might not have the kind of background. What I said personally, because I was Oregon's first new senator in 30 years, I said, look, our senators were always about wood products. I'm going to fight like crazy for forestry. By the way, we got a major bill passed that I'd worked on for years a week ago to end something called fire borrowing so we can get into prevention. But I said, I'm going to help us get into new fields. So I'm not going to throw mud at any of my colleagues, but clearly, apropos of your first question, yes, Congress was slow to get into these questions.
All right, here, let's take a question.
You mentioned wanting to protect people's privacy, as we've seen in the EU with the GDPR regulations, knowing that probably couldn't happen at a national level under the administration. Is that something we could do in Oregon, and what pushback do you think you would see from the technology industry here and in the Valley?
I think I'd like to simplify it because obviously the EU has set up a fairly comprehensive regime. I think we've got to establish the principle once and for all that you own your data, period. You own your data. So what does that mean in the real world? It's not enough for a company to bury in technical lingo some notice in their privacy statement. It's not enough for a company to have some convoluted process for what is called opting out, where basically they get all your stuff unless with all the stuff in your schedule you figure out a way to contact them and say, hey, take me out. I believe you should own your own data and you should be empowered to make sure that nobody else gets that data unless you have given explicit permission up front before there's any kind of commercial activity to get it. So there are going to be a lot of pieces, to the puzzle. Apparently, Facebook announced just this morning some other kinds of steps with respect to elections. But for me, the bedrock principle here is you should own your own data. And I guess there are two things that I want to see happen soon, okay? One, I want to see that embedded as the core principle with respect to users and social media. And second, I want to defeat Mr. Pai, the head of the Federal Communications Commission, and protect net neutrality. Because I'm telling you, this has real consequences for users and Oregonians. And for those who aren't up on this, what net neutrality means is you pay your internet access fee, you get to go where you want, when you want, and how you want. And everybody gets treated the same. A poor kid in rural Oregon where I was is just as important as a high flyer in New York or LA. Mr. Pai's got a different agenda. Mr. Pai basically wants those people to pay a fee to the high flyers and set up paid prioritization. He has a vision of digital serfdom in America. So those are the two things that I want to see happen now.
Hi, thanks. On the topic of, consent to use data and the premise that personal data belongs to people rather than the platforms or the marketers using it, what needs to happen, or what do you think will happen next? It's a nice principle, but mechanically, what will happen, do you think?
Well, quaint idea, but Congress has to pass a law establishing it. And look, if you had told me in January of 2017 that the Children's Health Insurance Program, one of the most important of all health insurance programs, would be reauthorized for 10 years because Orrin Hatch and I put together a coalition to do it, I would have said again, you're hallucinating. We created enough political pressure for it, from kids advocates in rural areas. Look, if I say one thing today that I hope you'll take away, is that with all of the challenges and with all of the frustrations about the changes at the White House, political change still starts in doesn't start in Washington, D.C. or in Salem and trickle down. It's bottoms up. It's how we stopped the gutting of the Affordable Care Act, and it's how we passed the Children's Health Plan. So if there is a grassroots uprising about this issue of who owns user data, and people say, I'm not going to let these guys sell it, splice it, market it, whatever they're going to do without my permission, we can get it passed. We can get it passed in this Congress. And Mr. Zuckerberg is apparently going to have a couple of very pleasant days before the Congress this week, and that's the time to start.
So, and he's not appearing before any
He is
of your
not.
committees?
He is not coming to the Intelligence Committee. He is coming to in the Senate, the Commerce and the Judiciary Committee.
So I want to follow up on Brian's question a little bit, because at its simplest basis, it could be that you pass a law, Congress passes a law that says that Facebook or anybody have to require an opt-in. They have to ask me, check this box if we can use your data. Not check this box if you don't want us to use your data, but check this box, which is a significant difference.
Explicit consent from you up front before anybody messes with your personal data. Opt in, out, opt out. You know, everybody's going to get lost in that. It's real basic. You have to give the okay for them to do anything with your data.
Okay, so I admire your boldness on that. I find it hard to believe that Facebook is going to take that lying down.
Well, I will tell you, Mark, obviously 2 weeks ago they wouldn't. But go to YouTube. Mark Zuckerberg promised, he promised, his words, not mine, that that's what he would do years ago. So he has broken a promise. He has broken a promise to the millions, the billions who use his company. You can see him, he looks right in the camera and basically says, we are not going to let people get access to your data without your say-so. So hang on a sec. So 2 weeks ago, absolutely. I can see how they'd oppose it. But where they're going now, they're going to be people who are going to say Facebook ought to be broken up. There have been a number of proposals and ideas for doing it. And I think unless he finds a way to honor the promise that he made several years ago, he's going to have a law on his hands. And by the way, I'll be for it.
All right, we are close to out of time. I want to revisit your role on the Senate Intelligence Committee. Last year, when
my older child calls it the so-called Intelligence Committee.
So last year, we were all excited about the investigation into Russians' involvement in the election, and here we are a year later. Where is your committee? Is a report forthcoming soon? Is Donald Trump a person of interest?
I think the technical term Bob Mueller uses is he's a subject, but I'm a lawyer in name only. My wife agreed to marry me only because she said you're not a good lawyer. So I think real lawyers will tell you you can go from a subject to being a person of interest fairly quickly, depending on what happens when you sit down with Bob Mueller. I think there are kind of two forums to watch, and let me kind of be specific about both. Bob Mueller works on the criminal side, and I'm not going to talk about anything classified, but he hired like 15 people, and 14 of them are experts in financial fraud and financial prosecutions. And I have always felt that the most important issues were the follow the money issues. and you said, where is the Intelligence Committee going? This is one of my priorities. I don't think adequate attention has been given to the follow the money issues in the Intelligence Committee. And this is essentially a policy difference I have with the committee leadership. Not personalities or somebody's a bad guy or anything. They don't really seem to think that follow the money issues are part of the Intelligence Committee's portfolio. I've said, whoa, the heart of our committee's work is counterintelligence. The way you compromise somebody is with money. This is the heart of our work. So I have put holds on Trump administration appointees. I've called for public hearings. I will do everything I can to stop the committee from going forward without getting into the follow the money issues. Michael Cohen, the president's money man, should come in front of the Intelligence Committee. Donald Trump Jr. should come in front of the Intelligence Committee. These are in public sessions. And Jared Kushner should come. And I'm going to keep pushing for that.
Sounds like a lot of good TV. We are done. I'm sorry we're out of time. Ron Wyden?
Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Thank you.